Yeah.
Hi there, and welcome to a Wellness Center workshop. So today's workshop is Managing Unruly Emotions, Tips and Tricks, Part 1. So my name is Deanna Loziniak. I'm one of the graduate interns this year in the counseling services. And
I'm Jennifer Blismo, and I'm one of the pre-doc interns at the Wellness Center.
so what we're going to do today is take some time to kind of talk about our emotions and how they function, and talking a little bit more in depth about what they can bring up in us while we're experiencing them, talking a little bit more about ways to identify our emotions in the moment, and then a brief skill that can be really helpful to increase awareness, especially when we're feeling really overwhelmed by our emotions towards the end. And so with that, one of the first things that we're going to kind of talk about is the way that emotions kind of unfold. And so this takes place really similarly to like a timeline fashion. So the way that we think about this is that our emotional experience typically starts with some kind of triggering or like sparking event. Um, and then once that event happens, it kind of like starts this reaction that includes our emotional experience and some other kind of response within us, which is typically like a reaction, or some kind of behavioral piece that comes very soon after our emotional experience. And it's also interesting to think about this because the same one kind of event or experience, kind of like a triggering or sparking event, might bring about very different feelings for a number of different people or even the same person, but based on the situation or the context that they're experiencing this kind of triggering event within, if that makes sense. And so just to give like a really quick example of what that might look like is, say, during the course of your day, you end up getting into an argument with a friend, and that argument then kind of sparks your response. And you might feel some feelings of like anger or frustration. And then based on that emotional experience, then what might come out of that is, maybe you yell at your friend, or maybe you feel ashamed, or maybe you need to take some space. So that's just one like really quick example of how one event could then trigger through like this timeline of an emotional response and then a reaction or like a behavioral response. Anything else to add on that?
No, I think that is a great example because it kind of leads into the part that I was hoping to talk about, and that's the emotional identification. And as you were talking, especially about that particular example where you have an argument with your friend, and some of those feelings that you experience may be sadness, maybe anger, maybe frustration. In no ways are we saying that you shouldn't feel those. We all feel those at times, but it's that management piece that we're really looking at, focusing in on by the end of this workshop. So when we think about like unruly emotions, it usually is those more negative emotions that can become unruly and can like change our behavioral response relatively quickly. When we talk about anger or frustration is what leads to anger. We keep everything inside and it kind of bottles up. I think of a lot of times I use the example of like a soda bottle where you're constantly shaking it and it's all inside and all of that pressure is inside. And what you want to do is you want to slowly release that pressure. And that's the management piece, because if you don't slowly release that pressure, what happens is that anger is going to come and it's just going to like completely explode on everyone and everything around it. And this is where we see people lashing out at others, whether that's direct lashing out, or, indirect lashing out, where we talk about other people, or situations, to everyone else. And what we're looking to do is, again, to validate that you are frustrated, or angry at something, and just kind of working at managing what that behavioral reaction is. Maybe you do talk to someone about it, but you don't talk to 20 people. You talk about it in order to kind of, just work through it. Or you try to, minimize, the yelling at someone, or the stomping away from someone, or slamming a door, or any of those things. Because unfortunately, when we have these extreme responses, one of the things we have to consider is that, like, that may damage a relationship, down the road. So we really just want to kind of like experience that emotion in a healthier way. When we look at things like sadness, a lot of times we don't, no one is really truly comfortable sitting with sadness and loss. And a lot of times that's also turns into frustration and anger. So all of these are somewhat connected. And we look at the same thing with anxiety. When you're really worried about something, think about it, if you're walking into like an exam or something like that, and you're worried, and people are around you, and they're talking about, what's going to be on the test, and what did you study for, and stuff like that. A lot of times we can get very snippy, and just react to people, or even following a test. I know for myself personally, being in school, I hated talking about exams afterwards, because it just made me worry about what I may or may not have gotten correct, and all of that. So again, when we look at this stuff, we may respond verbally in a way that, isn't great, and is more reactive. Or we, may react behaviorally, where we, slam doors, or stomp away, or get into, physical fights, or just behave in a way that truly does not define us. It's defining our reaction to a particular situation. Anything that I'm missing with regards to that, Deanna?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to continue to build off of that, I think one of the things that you started to highlight that is really important too is that, just like in our reaction to um, kind of like our triggering situations and our responses, there's this emotional piece, maybe a thought-based piece, and like a behavioral piece. And I think too, in working towards this emotional identification, I think it's important too to kind of acknowledge that there's, kind of like physical sensations that go along with our experience of emotions and can aid us in kind of like identifying our emotions, as well as that like emotional piece, and that piece that can feel a little bit overwhelming sometimes, in a different way. And so with things like, say, like anger, which we've kind of been using as an ongoing example, maybe you notice like your heart rate's increased, or there's some muscle tension, um, things like that. Or with sadness, maybe, there's a knot in your stomach, or something like that. And so I think that can be a really good kind of like cue for yourself and things to tune into, that can help you identify what emotion you might be feeling, because it's not always really straightforward.
No.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different emotions that kind of overlap, as you had mentioned earlier. And also just to kind of acknowledge as well that a lot of times, like how we're feeling physically, in addition to, how we might be feeling emotionally, the combination of those two things can often kind of impact how we might respond. So
Mm-hmm.
just to kind of put that in the context of like that timeline that we started to talk about earlier. And so when we start to learn how to identify our emotions, that's kind of like the first step towards building our awareness, which ultimately, like, continuing to build awareness throughout this kind of like emotional timeline process, and emotional identification, that awareness kind of acts like a pause button. And so the more you're able to press pause, then the more you can work towards kind of choosing your reaction instead of experiencing very quickly emotional response reaction.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, just to kind of highlight that and point that out.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to also note that um, we had both mentioned it, that our emotions aren't clear cut. We could have, we could at one point look at the experience and identify a particular emotion, and kind of the more we think about it and the more we kind of process what's going on around us, that emotion may switch to something else. So it's not an easy thing. And sometimes, like, our emotions can come and go as we think about an experience. And I think it takes practice um, to kind of like know what we're experiencing, and recognize that, there are also situations where people are more quick to label their emotion as, anger, because it seems as though, like, society or people around us say, well, you should be angry. And that may not be what we're experiencing. We may be experiencing sadness, but socially that may not be okay. So this is a great opportunity to kind of figure out what is your personal experience and learn to be okay with what that experience is without those external factors coming into place telling you how you should feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. Because then, you know, the more that you can get comfortable identifying and maybe starting to stay with those emotions or feel maybe a little bit less judgmental about yourself for experiencing those emotions as they come and go, uh,
Hmm.
that in itself can kind of open up more options for then how you might choose to react in a way that might be a little bit more adaptive or effective when you're experiencing that emotion in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. And being like you had mentioned, being accepting of yourself. It's okay that I'm feeling sad right now. And how does that actually come into play with, what your response is going to be, so it's not an easy thing to do. It's very difficult for us to all turn the mirror on ourselves and look at situations. Um, but I think even just opening up a person's perspective about this and kind of taking away that judgment and talking about these more difficult emotions, is a great way to kind of get started, and a great way to kind of look at yourself and, do it in a way that's healthy, as opposed to, being judgmental about yourself, or beating yourself up, and not showing yourself that compassion that we all need to show ourselves a little bit more than we probably all do.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point too, that this is like very much a practiced thing. Like it's
Mhm.
going to take time and that's okay.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think too, just to give kind of like an example, um, so like we've been talking about sadness a little bit as well. And so, you know, say you're at a spot where, you know, okay, you can recognize like I'm feeling sadness based on, you know, after this triggering event. And maybe your typical response would be to kind of withdraw from your social supports like friends or family. And maybe that leaves you feeling a little isolated and lonely. So just to kind of like demonstrate what an alternative response might be in that situation, right? So if you're in the moment where you're noticing, okay, I'm feeling pretty sad after, you know, this event. I know that I normally kind of withdraw from other people and take some time to myself. But if you're feeling like you typically feel isolated, then maybe what you could do is pick one kind of trusted friend, family member, anyone who you identify as being in your support system, and just reach out to them. And even if you don't tell them what's going on, you know, just to say, oh, hey, you know, just wanted to say hi, like I'm thinking about you, anything like that, that can kind of help to cultivate some connection. Um, that's a different response, right? So that's
Mhm.
a could be considered like a more effective or helpful response to the emotion of sadness that you were feeling before.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's tough to do that. It's tough to like make those changes because become comfortable with whatever we do. And, in talking with people about this, um, and you put out the, option of an alternative response, and it's scary because you're like, well, I don't know. But at the same time, you said, we're on the outside looking in and going, well, how are these, options or these responses that you've become so familiar with, how are those working out for you?
Mhm.
Um, and stuff like that. And again, I think when you go through and do that self-evaluation, that's all it is. It's an evaluation, and just, looking to gather that objective information. And, that's when you sit down and go, well, this isn't working. When I get sad, I'm isolating from other people, and that's not helping me like feel better. Not that you should have the expectation of, okay, I'll reach out to someone and I'll automatically feel better. But if anything, it's just kind of like easing that weight of sadness just
Mhm.
a little bit, so you can kind of like start to see what's around you, and just kind of like remove that sadness trigger, off to the side a little bit, so you can see what is going on around you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because I think part of like what you were describing that stood out to me was that I think something that can make it really tough in the moment to like change our response is that like these emotions, when they're really overwhelming, they feel like they're going to last forever.
Hmm.
And I think, we've probably all at some point experienced an emotional response like that. And so I think it can be really hard to choose to react a different way than what we might normally do
Yeah.
if it doesn't feel like it's going to end soon, which is absolutely understandable and kind of why it makes it, extra tricky. But also, I think I'm like thinking of picturing like emotions as more of like a wave or kind of like a tide coming in. And so, just thinking about, it's not like a line on a graph that continues to climb up, right?
Right.
It's this experience where once it started, it's like a wave and there might be a peak, but then it also crashes and comes down and like returns back to the normal, you
Yep.
know, ocean tide. Um, and so just to kind of like keep that in mind, and like you said, there will be that time where we're able to come back to like the rest of what's going on around us. And so yeah, even if you're reaching out to someone like, maybe this won't work, or I'm still feeling really sad, and it might feel a little uncomfortable to reach out to someone that way, um, but then just to kind of test it out, maybe an hour or two later you'll be really glad that you did.
Yeah. And that's another piece of not putting these like time expectations on yourself, and letting that wave kind of like reach its peak and come down. It might take a few minutes. It might take, a couple hours, like you said. It may even take longer. And while you want to be aware of the time piece, you don't want to set yourself up, for more disappointment, and more of that negative response.
Yeah, and just to acknowledge too that it'll probably be different for everyone. Maybe you have friends that seem to go through their emotions a bit quicker, but if yours hang around for a little while longer, that's okay too.
Yeah.
And like you said, just something to be aware of. Um, yeah. And so we talked a lot about kind of the importance of awareness, emotion identification, and how emotions can kind of like play out over this timeline from experiencing a trigger to your response. And now, unless there's anything else, Jen, we can kind of go into a really quick, portable um, kind of skill for taking a minute and opening up our awareness a little bit more.
Yeah. No, I think that'd be great.
Awesome. So, what we're going to use is called square breathing. And so, deep breathing techniques, I really personally love deep breathing techniques because it kind of tunes into your biological, like your physiological response, which we mentioned a couple of times earlier. And it gives space for your mind to kind of like recalibrate almost and come back to the present moment. And so, which can be really tough to do a lot of times when, we're feeling overwhelmed by an emotion or really caught up maybe at the top of that wave of our experience of an emotion. And so, what square breathing can do is just take a couple minutes and kind of slow things down physically and mentally. And then that way it kind of like creates like a little window for you then to refocus your awareness in an even more like intentional way, and maybe even give you some space to like choose a new reaction for your emotional experience. So with that, what it's going to do, the square breathing is really just a deep breathing pattern. And so we're going to be breathing in the pattern of a square, and each side of the square is going to be held for a count of 4, which I'll keep track of so you don't have to worry about that. So what it's going to look like is it's going to go inhale for 4, hold the inhale for 4, exhale for 4, and hold for 4. So I'll lead us through 3 rounds of the square, if that makes sense. So when you're ready, I'll just invite you to sit down or lay down in a comfortable position with whatever you've got around you. If you'd like to close your eyes, you're more than welcome to. If not, that's okay as well. And so just refocus to your breathing and your inner experience. And we're going to inhale and hold and exhale and hold and inhale and hold and exhale and hold. Final round, inhale and hold and exhale and hold. And that is square breathing.
Thank you.
Yes.
And I think that's something, again, going into that, bringing it kind of back around to that practice aspect. If you find yourself struggling with that, setting some time, either at the beginning of your day or at the end of your day, and just practicing that will help it become a little bit more of a muscle memory type of situation, so that when you do feel those emotions starting to take over, you can say square breathing, and your body's going to already know what to do, and how to handle that, recognizing that maybe that first round goes a little bit quicker than 4 seconds, but your goal is to get up to that 4 seconds and make it more of a pattern. So that's kind of my little disclaimer about breathing. It's practice it when you're not feeling those emotions, so that when you do experience those emotions, it just becomes a little bit more of a pattern, and easier to access.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is a great one to practice in the moment and outside of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, I think that's pretty much all that we had today for our Managing Unruly Emotions Part 1. And this is a part of like a larger series as well. So there'll be a few more kind of portions of this workshop that will continue to talk about like managing our emotions in different ways as well. So thanks for joining us, and look for the rest of the portions of the workshop coming soon.
Great. Thank you, everyone.